Good morning, and welcome to another Seize the Day. Grateful to be here this morning with you. Today, the weather in South Carolina, as you can see, is pretty sunny behind me. Beautiful day. Little chilly actually. It's in the 70s right now, and usually wake up in the morning. The wind wasn't blowing quite as much, and just a little humid, but not terrible. But grateful to be here. It's the last day for our vacation here. So tomorrow we leave and come back to beautiful New Hampshire. And I enjoy all those seasons. I like all the changes. So I'm glad to be going back. But it was great to be here. My wife was making fun of me. She's saying I'm getting darker and darker on the screen the more the days pass in the week. So I just had pretty good walks on the beach. Read a couple of really good books. And I'm just ready to get back to go. It's been a good time just to be away for a few days like this. But I'm also grateful that through technology we can just always be together and begin our day the same way no matter where we are in the world. So thankful for that. I learned a couple of things this week as I've been preparing for our Seize the Days. And one of those is something I want to share with you. But I thought I'd just do a quick little recap of where we've been. We've been in a series called Misunderstood. And the idea is that people don't miss the opportunities that Jesus has given us to get to know him better. But having, shared with us his teaching, shared with us his life, we've moved to a place where we truly understood the things that Jesus has been saying. So to go from missing to understanding, that's always the bridge that we're trying to span in our times that we're spending in these mornings. But we're up now into Matthew chapter 14, around verses 12 through 21. News of John the Baptist's beheading has come to Jesus, pushing him to a place where he is seeking some solace, he's seeking some privacy, gets into a boat, I'm sure weighed with all of the just natural human concerns that every one of us would have at passing of a loved one. But yet we see something of Jesus' heart, right? In the midst of his moving, people are going on with their lives as well. So Jesus isn't the only one that has trouble, that is afflicting him here in this morning, in the morning of John the Baptist. He has a lot of people who are sick, and they're looking to Jesus too for some kind of respite. And what does he do when he sees them? It says that he has compassion. I remember reading that and just pausing for a moment and just thinking to myself, I want to be that kind of guy that not that you have to always put on a happy face or that you're trying to deny your feelings. I'm not talking about that. That to me is a little shallow. I mean, we could live life and be challenged by life circumstances, but what I'm talking about is Jesus in the midst of his own inner turmoil here. He still looks out with compassion on people. He doesn't allow that to color the way in which he engages them. And he begins to heal and interact, and I think, man, that says something about the tenor of Jesus' life and what he's trying to accomplish. So, in the midst of that, then there is this story where the disciples come to Jesus and say, "Hey, there's like 5,000 men here, and that's not even counting the women and the children. We need to let them go so they can find something to eat, because we're out here in the middle of nowhere, and it's going to take them some time to find a place for them to find some kind of food." And then Jesus, it appears in the text, kind of nonchalantly just says to them, "You give them something to eat." And that whole interaction with his disciples causes them to take a look at their own resources, and they look around and they go, "We only have like 5 loaves and 2 fish. This need is way beyond me." And then I think Jesus gives us the crux to the whole story, and that is, he just turns to them and says, "Bring them to me." And then he breaks them. No, well, first he praises God. That whole praise, gave thanks, is the word where we get our English word eulogy. Eu is preface for good, and logos for word, and so you put them together. It's like a eulogy that you would share at a funeral service, right? But also this eulogy was a good word. So God is in communion with his Father, Jesus, right? Speaking to his Father, he gives thanks. He breaks the bread. He gives it to the disciples, and the disciples are the ones who now pass that out. And so what you find here is like all of this work is being done and accomplished through his disciples. And that's something that I want you to really recognize as we're going through these passages. It's not just the miracle of what Jesus is accomplishing here that is spectacular. What is really spectacular is that he's also raising up men and women to engage in this work of continuing this kingdom proclamation until the time in which Jesus will come again. His first coming is marked by that crucifixion on the cross. The second coming, he says, is coming till he could redeem all things. It's a view of the future that Jesus has given us that is part of the proclamation of this good news of the kingdom of heaven. And so what you and I discover in this text is that there is work to be done. Jesus, think about this. He has chosen to use you and me as co-laborers in this work. It's not that just God comes down and like superhero style, vanquishes the evil one. We find ourselves now thinking, different kinds of thoughts here. No. What he does is he's engaging all of us to play a part in this work of redemption. So all of us are being called into this kind of service. So to me, that is the bottom line, a major point of what this text is really trying to proclaim. Not just the miracles of what he did, but how the people of God need to respond and then move forward. And so I found this like a collateral passage that is really interesting, and I thought I'd share that with you this morning. It's a psalm. It's Psalm 78, and in Psalm 78, it gives us a description of much of the activity that God was doing, but the activity isn't so much to demonstrate his power, although it does. The psalm is meant to make us mindful of the way in which we are to respond to that. Much the same way, like in the story of the feeding of the 5,000, it's not so much what Jesus has done, but he's making us realize that the resources of God are at our disposal. What we have to do is bring to him whatever we have. But there is this trust factor, right? There is this faith factor. Not to say that everything you want is just given to you. This is always in the will of God. Even Jesus, in the midst of this miracle, is still, giving thanks not just for the food, but for this, but for the will of God that is being made known. There are a lot of things that we don't have to think twice about. What is God's will? How we treat people, how you even treat your enemies. How are we supposed to conduct ourselves in this world? How we use our time, how we use our resources. You don't have to think twice about those things sometimes. And God has provided us with this kind of revelation. So I want you to look at Psalm 78 with me. And I just thought we'd spend a few moments this morning and encourage one another with these words. So Asaph is one of the men that was responsible for the leading of worship in the temple. If you go back and just do like a word search on Asaph, you'll find out that Asaph wrote a number of psalms. Psalm 73 is one of those favorites for me because it shows how Asaph is beginning to lose his way a bit. And he gets his eyes off of God and he starts putting his eyes on everybody around him. and he kind of loses his way and then resolves some of that tension in his life. Um, so, so listen to Psalm 78. And this is coming from a guy who is, perhaps this is a song, right, that they would sing in worship. And these songs were meant to be emotive. They were meant to draw people in and to teach them, right? Just like a good song. You ever find the lyrics of that song, they just stay with you for a very, very long time. They could be frivolous, or sometimes the words of a song could really just, just capture your heart in a way that whenever you hear that song, you're brought right back to this experience. And I think that's what Asaph tries to do with this psalm. He says, "O my people, hear my teaching and listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things from of old, what we have heard and known, what our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders he has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded our forefathers to teach their children, so that the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children. Then they would put their trust in God and would not forget his deeds, but would keep his commands. They would not be like their forefathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation whose hearts were not loyal to God, whose spirits were not faithful to him." Do you notice a couple of themes already taking place in this opening of the psalm? One, that God is actively engaged in revealing himself, so that his will and his ways is not a mystery, but it is beginning to be divulged, so that the people would have a basis on which to develop a relationship with God. Do you also realize in here that there is this constant repetition just in the first 8 verses about how we all have a responsibility to make sure that we are retelling this story, so that the story isn't just meant for just one generation. It's meant so that when you rise up, when you sit down, when you walk along the way, that you're sharing these insights about God and how he's engaging all of his creation. That is something that we are then being asked to share. Verse 4, right? We will not hide them from their children. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders he's done, right? And then he says, not only are we going to teach our children, but verse 6, so the next generation would know, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children. I'm telling you today, in 2022, if we are not mindful of this passage, we're losing out on a whole generation of people being raised up to really know God and serve him faithfully, who begin to put this mind of God on themselves so that they live with love and joy and peace and patience, with a gentleness and goodness that can only be found from the Spirit of God that rests within us. So who's going to tell them if we're not telling them? And if we don't know these things, don't you see how God has created this whole environment where this work of ministry that he is beginning, that he has set up, it is empowered by those who are loyal to him, who will show themselves to be faithful. And he says, and look what happens. Look at verse 8, when he says they manifest themselves as a stubborn and rebellious generation. What happened? But they invoked the disfavor of God in a number of ways. There's a story here now in verse 9. He says, the men of Ephraim, right? So this is the tribe that comes from Joseph's line. He says, the men of Ephraim, though armed with bows, turned back on the day of battle. They did not keep God's covenant and refused to live by his law. They forgot what he had done, the wonders he had shown them. He did miracles in the sight of their fathers in the land of Egypt, in the region of Zoan. He divided the sea, led them through. He made the waters stand firm like a wall. He guided them with the cloud by day and with the light from the fire all night. He split the rocks in the desert, gave them water as abundant as the seas. He brought streams out of a rocky crag and made water flow down like rivers. Don't you realize that here, Asaph, multiple generations, this is probably after the exile, where Israel fell under the hands of the Babylonians during that takeover by the king of the Babylonians, right, Nebuchadnezzar. And then the God would raise up Persian kings like Cyrus, right, and allow the people to come back. See, there has been a lot of history, so it's not like this just happened, a few years ago. No, we're talking now a millennia or so. But for Asaph, the work of God amongst the people in that day when he delivered them out of the hands of Egypt and brought them on that path to securing this promised land, that was worthy of remembering. In fact, isn't that what is celebrated every year in Passover? When people get together and they remember the day that God took Israel out of the hands of the Egyptians. And he did it with power. The Egyptians had no army. There were no resources. And yet God did for them what they could not do for themselves. They defeated the most powerful military regime in its day without even lifting up a sword. And so when the people left and all of that came to pass, you could see how God has already been demonstrating grace and mercy and patience. But notice what it says in verse 17. They continued to sin against him, rebelling in the desert against the Most High. They willfully put God to the test by demanding the food they craved. There's a great passage in the book of Numbers where the Israelites are complaining and saying, we remember the days when we lived in Egypt, the cucumbers and the leeks and the oil and the wine, but they forgot the 400 years of the taskmaster's whips that kept them oppressed. They forget the tears that they shed day in and day out, asking God to come and redeem them from such an oppression. And now all they're remembering is like a bouillabaisse? No, I don't think so. So he says here, they willfully put him to the test. And then in verse 19 it says, they spoke against God, saying, can God spread a table in the desert? And when he struck the rock, he says, water gushed out, streams flowed abundantly, God providing them with much needed water, even in the midst of the desert. Why? Because that desert experience wasn't meant to be lasting for their whole lifetime. When they were taken out of Egypt, they were to go into the promised land. The reason why they turned around and wandered another 38 years in the wilderness wasn't God's idea. It was their own rebellion. They refused to go in and take this land, and as a result, that whole generation would wind up wandering in the wilderness, being led by Moses. And so, even in their obstinance, here Asaph is reminding us again of God's provision, and that provision, he says, he gave them water, even in the midst of this desert. Right, streams flowed abundantly. And then they turned around and said, yeah, it's good that he gave you water out of a rock, but can he give us food? Can he supply meat for his people? And that's, again, a reference to the book of Numbers and the people's rebellion. And he says, and when the Lord heard them, he was very angry. His fire broke out against Jacob. His wrath rose against Israel. Right? Both words that are referring to the 12 tribes of Israel, Jacob's sons. Right, that now Jacob and name changed to Israel. But he says, for they did not believe in God or trust in his deliverance. Do you see, like, all of these miracles, they're meant to evoke in you and I a faithfulness, a grounding, a hope. That's why I tell people sometimes when we read through this New Testament, they're always looking for the miracles, like, oh, I'm going to pray God to do this for me today, when really the provisions of God were really meant to strengthen one's faith, their resolve to recognizing that God has all things under his control, and that if I hide my life in his, it is the safest place. And now it gives me a perspective on which to go out and live life in a way that respects all of humanity, even your enemy, going that extra mile, forgiving 70 times 7. But notice here he says, yet he gave a command to the skies above, open the doors of the heavens. He rained down manna for the people to eat. He gave them the grain of heaven. Men ate the bread of angels, and he sent them all the food that they could eat. He let loose the east wind from the heavens and led forth the south wind by his power. He rained down meat on them like dust, flying birds like sand on the seashore. He made them come down inside their camp, all around their tents. They ate till they had more than enough, for he had given them what they craved. But before they turned from the food they craved, even while it was still in their mouths, God's anger rose against them. He put to death the sturdiest among them, cutting down the young men of Israel. Yeah, you see, here's another aspect, right, that sometimes we'd rather not talk about. But there is a holiness to God. There is a righteousness of God. It's not just about, meeting people's need and desire, and then they can treat one another and treat God any way they want. The thing is that God is the one who's going to provide that judgment, not you and I. It's his place to judge, not ours. We're not the weed killers, right? Remember that story that Jesus told us about the wheat and the weeds. Our job is to grow wheat. Our job is to demonstrate a faithfulness even in the midst of all this calamity. But rest assured, God is going to hold people responsible. Evil will be recompensed. Judgment will come. But he is the one that's going to bring it. It tells us in Romans, right, and Romans 8, he says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And that is true. And so here, this is another one of those references that you would read about in the book of Numbers, and you see that even here in Psalm 78. I'm just stalling here for a second because I thought maybe I would give you the exact reference here if you'd like to go down and look. But like Numbers chapter 11. In Numbers chapter 11, it says, but while the meat was still between their teeth and before it could be consumed, the anger of the Lord burned against his people, and he struck them with a severe plague. Yeah, this whole context here that the psalmist Asaph is referring to. And again, just to remind you, Asaph wrote this song about what took place in the history of Israel as a way of telling the story and communicating the principle of the story from generation to generation to generation, so that we would become aware not only of the provision of God, of God's compassion towards his people, but also that we serve a God who is just and holy and will recompense evil for evil, right? And yet look what he says here in verse 32. He says, in spite of all this, they kept on sinning. In spite of his wonders, they did not believe. So he ended their days in futility and their years in terror. Whenever God slew them, they would seek him. They eagerly turned to him again. They remembered that God was their rock, that God Most High was their Redeemer. But when they would flatter him with their mouths, lying to him with their tongues, their hearts were not loyal to him. They were not faithful to his covenant. Yet he was merciful. He forgave their iniquities. He did not destroy them. Time after time he restrained his anger, did not stir up his full wrath. He remembered that they were but flesh, a passing breeze that does not return. Think about that. Our lives are, just like he says here, like a wind. Ecclesiastes underscores that, right? He says that sometimes it's like chasing after the wind. We're mortal. Our days are numbered. I use the expression all the time, but I said we have so much sand in the hourglass. And yet you realize that God, who has been on the on the side of providing and guiding and informing and revealing, that there are some who responded well, but there were many who would act in rebellion. And yet God demonstrated a patience, 70 times 7, right? Because one day there will be judgment, but not yet. So look how this psalm then comes to a conclusion. He says, how often they rebelled against him in the desert and grieved him in the wasteland. Again and again they put God to the test. They vexed the Holy One of Israel. They did not remember his power, the day he redeemed them from the oppressor. Like how many, see, this is the thing about miracles. You're satisfied in the moment, but if it doesn't do anything to change your heart, to change your perspective, then it's just like a spoiled kid that he just wants what he wants when he wants it. And there's no sense of any kind of faithfulness or love that is being, displayed here. He says they did not remember his power, the day he redeemed them from their oppressor, the day he displayed his miraculous signs in Egypt, his wonders in the region of Zoan. He turned their rivers to blood. They did not drink from their streams. He sent swarms of flies. See, all of these now that he goes on to talk about were part of the plagues that took place in Israel, in Egypt, prior to this mass exodus. And then he goes on. He says, remember how this would end on that day of Passover, where he struck down all the firstborn of Egypt, the first fruits of manhood in the tents of Ham. He brought his people out like a flock. He led them like sheep through the desert. He guided them safely, so they were unafraid, but the sea engulfed their enemies. Thus he brought them to the border of his holy land, to the hill country his right hand had taken. He drove out nations before them, allotted their lands to them as an inheritance. He settled the tribes of Israel in their homes. But they put God to the test, rebelled against the Most High. They did not keep his statutes. Like their fathers, they were disloyal and faithless, as unreliable as a faulty bow. They angered him with their high places. They aroused his jealousy with their idols. And when God heard them, he was very angry. He rejected Israel completely. See, notice how this ends. It says, then the Lord woke from his sleep as one wakes from the stupor. And he put back the tents of Joseph. He chose the tribe of Ephraim. And then one day he chose a man, David, his servant, and he took him from the sheep pens. From tending the sheep, he brought to be the shepherd of his people Jacob, of Israel, his inheritance. That's an interesting text, that he took David to be the shepherd of his people. I don't know if you can remember this, but way back when we were studying the early genealogy of Jesus, it was saying that this Jesus, that he would be born in Bethlehem, the least of all the tribes of Israel, and he become the shepherd of his people. So Jesus is standing now into that covenant promise that God made with David way back in 2 Samuel chapter 7. A promise that there would always be this one who would come and rule, and that David would one day call him Lord. It's talking about Jesus, the Messiah. And now, my friends, here we have this text for us in Matthew chapter 14, where Jesus now is the one who is providing the bread from heaven. He is that bread. And one day he will be broken and offering his life as a ransom for the sins of men. And he's asking you and me to take this message out into the world, a message of redemption and of hope. And there will be some who will reject it. There will be those who, ignore it. But there will be many whose lives will be rescued, who will find hope and security, and they will be looking to a blessed future. My friends, that is what I think is really the story behind what Jesus is doing in this feeding of the 5,000, reminding us again that he is the God that provides the manna from heaven, and all of which to sustain us so that we can tell this story to the generations that come until that day that Jesus returns. He'll take care of the miracles. You and I, we need to demonstrate a faithfulness in all that we're doing. My friends, I hope that this today would be, this psalm, you'd write it down, go back and read it again. Read it through the lens of how Asaph is looking back on the history of what God did in Egypt. But now as Christians, you read this and look back on what God did on the cross of Calvary for you and for me, for all the nations of the world. And I hope it puts a smile on your face and it puts a spring in your step so that you go out to seize the day and never forget that God is good all the time. Well, I'm grateful I brought you on vacation. I hope you guys are feeling rested, and we'll go back next week and we'll go at it again as we constantly seek to just build one another up in this most holy faith. God bless you, my friends. Thank you for spending the week with me, and look forward, Lord willing, to our time together next week. God bless.